Welcome to this section of What is Public Policy, the first video recording in the POL 500 Introduction to Public Policy and the Policymaking Process. So here we're looking at the introductory materials in Module 1, focusing on the question, in general broad terms, what is public policy? Public policy is everything that government does and does not do. That's identified in the text, in the main text, Peters, and it suggests that policy is a function of government. So it's when we talk about public policy in particular, it's a function of government. We look at government and we try to focus on understanding the choices that government makes. So often you hear the answer to the large-scale question, what is public policy? It's that everything that government does and what government does not do. If we think about this term, everything government does and does not do, it has an empirical and descriptive nature to it. What I mean by that is, if you think about it again, that we can look at government, see what it does, and identify that, and categorize that, and archive it, and look at it, and so it's empirical in nature. It's something that can be empirically answered. For example, one of the things that we know government tends to do, especially at the federal level here in the United States, but also in many states, is government taxes its citizens. And we can identify that because most governments have laws, the Internal Revenue Code at the federal level, that grant governments or implement the taxing power that's given to government here in the United States, again at the federal level, through the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution. The power to tax is given to government. So we know government taxes, and there's reasons that government does this, but if we think about it at the large scale, it's just something that we can measure. We can look at the tax system itself. We can see how it operates. Generally, income tax here in the United States, for example, is a progressive system. That means that the more money you make, at certain levels, the dollars are taxed at a higher rate once you pass certain thresholds. So it's progressive in that sense that the more money you make, the more you end up paying in taxes, and the higher percentage you end up paying on some of that money in taxes. And there's a reason, again, behind that, and that's a part of public policy. But we know government, in terms of an empirical and descriptive sense, engages in the function of taxing. So that's just one example. We can look at many other things. Here in the United States, for example, the government spends money on defense. So defense spending, military, also has social welfare programs. There's a number of things that we could look at. The idea is that it can be empirical and descriptive in the sense of looking at public policy from the standpoint of everything government does and does not do. A slightly different question that we can look at is what government chooses to do and what it chooses not to do. It's a little bit different, and I've highlighted the term chooses here because I think it makes a difference in the sense that when you think of government, you think of the function of what it actually does. Now that's entirely empirical and descriptive. But when you think of government making choices between options, that's not entirely empirical. There's a part of it that certainly is because it's still the choice, the end result is what government does. But if we step back for a moment, we think about, well, if government has options, why did it choose to do A instead of B? And that's a little bit different. Instead of being so empirical and descriptive, that's more normative and value-laden. What I mean by that is it carries a judgment. So oftentimes we can think about public policy not only from the standpoint of what government does and does not do, but also from the standpoint of what government chooses to do and what it chooses not to do. And again, that's more normative and value-laden. For example, why is it that the tax policy in the United States is progressive? You know, maybe government could have done something else. Maybe it could have had a flat tax. I know in 1996, in the mid-1990s, Bob Dole was the Republican candidate for president, for example, and one of the pillars that he ran his presidential campaign, unsuccessfully ultimately, on was the idea of having a flat tax, that you would charge income at the same rate. There's also, by the way, we're only talking about income tax being progressive. But there are other kinds of forms of income, and when I say income, I mean mostly wages, by the way, because there's different types. You could have investment income, for example. You can have interest income. You can have different forms of income that might be taxed differently, sort of passive income versus active income. The point is, we can start digging beneath the surface of what government does, and we can start thinking about in greater detail some of the choices that government makes. Often we can, through historical understanding or through watching it play out in action over time, we can see how government, to some degree, is making choices. Or we can also look at the state today of what government does, and we can consider and sort of infer what those choices might have been, why government has come to this point. For example, again, to draw on something in terms of global politics, the United States has taken on an active role in global defense pretty much since World War II, with the founding, and one of the founding members of NATO, for example, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The United States has a commitment, essentially, I should say, to the defense of many nations, and spends a lot of money in that commitment and defense. All of those choices, that decision, that fact that the United States is an active member, a founding member, an active member of NATO, means that, and essentially acts as a protectorate of many of the NATO nations, in part with other countries, means that it's more likely that the government is going to have defense spending. So we can see sort of a kind of path dependence that's created through previous policy decisions. If we see that the government spends money on defense, then we might know that it's more likely that the United States does that because it made a choice, in part, years ago, decades ago, that created a likelihood that the United States would continue to spend money on defense. And so in this way, we can see that government's choices are a bit more detailed in terms of trying to understand what is public policy. It's not just looking descriptively, empirically at what governments do, but we can think about the choices that governments make as well. There are essentially three questions we look at when we say, what is public policy? And three kinds of questions that can sort of get us into this, this detail of what governments choose to do and choose not to do. And a lot of this there's a variety of details provided in the text, particularly in the Peters text. There's some additional information provided in the Stone reading on sort of making equity choices, and obviously those readings should happen, and whether you're viewing this before or after, those readings will help bring some of these issues to light. But in the larger picture, we can look at these three large-scale questions. What policies does government pursue? Why does government pursue certain policies? And what are the consequences of policies pursued? The what, the why, and the consequences are essentially the three questions. The what being the descriptive, the why being a little bit more normative, and then the consequences being more evaluative in the way that it looks at. So the consequences help us interpret what government is doing, and maybe also some of the choices that government has made. And then that information can often lead to, if we think about, again, later in the course, you'll talk about the policy-making process, the evaluation of policies. So the what, the why, and the consequences is sort of a large-scale three questions when we think about what is public policy. Focusing on the what policies does government pursue? So this is the descriptive form, what I was talking about earlier. And if you look here, there's a couple of things we can get out of this. There's how is this determined? How is what government does? How is it determined? And one method of looking at government priorities, what policies does government pursue, is to look at, for example, the federal budget. The federal budget can help us understand priorities. The reason why is because we can see that government is, it's an indirect measure. Some would argue it's a direct measure. But certainly the amount of money and the percentage of the entire government budget that's being focused on a certain area gives you some sense of not only what government's doing, but maybe also what are priorities for government, right? So just simply, again, looking at something as simple as the federal budget can give you some sense. And it won't be a detailed analysis, of course, but it gives you some starting point to determine not only what government literally does, how it spends its money is what government does in many ways, and but also, where government sets priorities. And we can see priorities and compare them over the years. And to the right here, you can see the U.S. federal spending in fiscal year 2013, and it's in billions of dollars. So the total budget for the U.S. federal government in 2013, fiscal year 2013, was about $3.4 trillion. And as you can see, it's broken up percentage-wise into a number of different areas. You can see that about 6% is paid in interest, and that's interest on debt that the government has. So the federal government carries a number of debt. which means implicitly that the government does not take in enough in terms of revenue in order to supply all of the things that it wants to do in a given year. And when it can't do that, then it issues debt. It takes on debt in order to provide those additional services and do the things that it wants to do or that it is doing when those things exceed the amount that is taken in revenue. So in order to pay for that, the government pays interest, like many of us do, on its debt. So we can see about 6%. We see Medicare and Medicaid at about 25%, Social Security about 23%. They're almost equivalent. You see almost half of the federal budget is taken up between Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. So what we can say right there is that social welfare, in terms of the U.S. government's priorities, or at least descriptively, social welfare takes up almost 50% of the federal government's budget, at least in 2013. By the way, we could compare that to 2012, 2011, 2010, 2014, 15, etc. And we can see over time, by the difference that's created in the pie, how much, what proportion, what percentage is being spent, whether or not these amounts have changed proportionately over time in terms of the total budget, of course, not in terms of total dollars, but or relative dollars, but in terms of the percentage of the total budget. We can also see that defense spending is about 18%. There's other mandatory spending at about 11%. And then there's the non-defense discretionary at about 17%. Some of that Defense Department spending, the implication there is that some of it's discretionary, meaning that government chooses to do it. It's not required, say, by legislative enactment, by law. The federal government sometimes has to pay certain things because it's made promises, sort of like contractual obligations. So they're non-discretionary. But what we can see here is that the amount of discretion in the budget, so the things that our leaders in the federal government can make choices about, comes to, roughly 17% if we put aside defense spending as being mandatory. We just consider it to be mandatory. About 17% of the federal budget is discretionary. So that's not a lot. That's less than, obviously, 20% or 1/5, something less than 1/5 of the entire income that comes in to the federal government can be spent on things that aren't already earmarked or, non-discretionary in that way. But if we were to look at this and start making some analysis, we might suggest that, for example, Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security are priorities. They're just priorities for the government, which means social welfare is a significant priority for the federal government. Defense is also somewhat of a priority. If we look at it proportionately in comparison to the other things, it's essentially equal to our discretionary spending. And that, we pay a decent amount, 6%, nothing too significant, but a decent amount, $221 billion a year to the interest, just to service the debt that the federal government has. And then we can start making some interpretations of this. For example, we could say, wow, if we had no debt, if the federal government had no debt, it would not have to service that debt. So we could get maybe 6%, about 221 billion back into the, to be spent for some other reason. But you can see how just looking at the federal budget spending can give you a sense of priorities. It's simply what the government is choosing to do, whether that choice is is put on them in a non-discretionary manner, or whether it's something that they're simply choosing to do. Why do governments pursue certain policies? Well, like we were showing back here in the budget, much of this is non-discretionary. So there's statutes, there's laws, the Social Security Act, for example, that requires government meet certain obligations. And Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid are, again, they're empowered by statute. So our Congress has determined that these things are obligations to the people, so they're non-discretionary spending. So in answering the second question, why do governments pursue certain policies? Well, it's because they have to, right? There's, again, this sort of path dependence that's created by choices that have been made in the past. I have here, the law compels them, told what to do by statute. So often the government is doing something because it's required to do so. Other times it's not just a compulsion, but there's a need. So sometimes government, say in discretionary spending, chooses to make choices and sees a strong need for a certain purpose. Or in defense spending, maybe there's a particular need in a given year or given area because of some of the other choices, some geopolitical situations. A war breaks out somewhere and the government, again, say where a NATO nation is attacked and the United States is under an international obligation through a treaty in order to respond. to that and defend. Maybe there has to be additional monies put forward in order to supply that additional need, to supply all that additional military strength to deal with that situation. So you can see that sometimes there's a need, but that need is also somewhat related to maybe sometimes a compulsion, a previous compulsion. And then there's also discretionary versus non-discretionary duties, meaning that government sometimes just makes choices that, again, are compelled by law, but other times they make the choices because they see it as important. I have over here on the right something that you're going to see later in this course, and you'll also see it for those of you that take POL 611 Administrative Law. You'll see this sort of hierarchy of laws, this relational sort of creation of our different sort of major categories of law that exist in the United States. And the hierarchy has, the Constitution at the top, the laws in the middle, and regulations at the bottom. One way to think about that is that the judiciary, if we think about it from branches of government, the judiciary is deals with constitutional issues, deals with much more interpretations of laws, but primarily is the sort of protector of constitutional minimal rights. The legislature, the legislative branch of government, makes law, and then the executive carries out those laws, mainly through creating regulations and some other things as well. And that often the legislature delegates that authority, the delegation power, the arrow you see there, to the executive. What we're saying here essentially is, and we're asking the big question, why do governments pursue certain policies? Well, this legal framework, this hierarchy of laws within our branches of government, it helps to create sort of this relational compulsion. So often we have government, again, when we say government, we in the United States here are branches of government, legislative, executive, and judicial. And the legislative branch, creates law, and oftentimes, like I said, in the Social Security Act, for example, that law compels government to do certain things or make something a priority. Of course, we can get into that law-making process, which is, very much a beast of political science and some other areas of study, but in that process, there's a lot of compulsion. There's a lot of reasons in which something becomes a law versus something else not becoming a law. And we'll talk about that. We'll talk about setting agendas in public policy and what that means, how things become an agenda, how things get on the agenda, certain issues. How do they, if we have many different options, like we have 10 different options of the choices we can make, why do we choose one thing over another? How does 3 out of the 10 make it above the other 7? And then out of those 3, how are choices made? Some of it is empirical, some of it's non-empirical, but we try to understand in terms of public policy, and not only what ends up coming out the end pipe, what kind of laws, legitimated policies occur, but why do governments end up pursuing those policies? And the answers are complicated. And what you'll see in one of the videos, the early video in this module that's offered to you, is that a number of theories that are put forward, actually I'm sorry, that's in the second module, but a number of theories that are put forward about sort of policy making theoretically. And then finally, the final question, what are the consequences of policies pursued? Generally framed as a policy evaluation analysis. So there's the consequence side, so there's the what, the why, and then the consequence, which actually should be highlighted here instead of the what. But what are the consequences of policies pursued? This is evaluation or analysis. And again, we're going to deal with this later in the course. As a matter of fact, we talk about policy analysis in the 5th module of the course, the last sort of substantive module before you start writing, start working on understanding a policy of your own as the final part of this course. But the evaluation is really trying to understand how these things occurred. And it can be framed from an advocacy perspective or from a neutral perspective. And what I mean by that is, if we go back to this notion that some choices, right, in a world of unlimited choices, governments can only do certain things. And why is it that certain things, government ends up doing some certain things and not others? In a world where they can do a lot of different things, why do some choices have preference over another? And there's a number of reasons for that, and sometimes you can look at that to try to understand the reason. You can look at it from different perspectives. You can look at it from a truly neutral third-party perspective, or you can look at it from an advocacy perspective. And this is talked about in the text in the first 2 chapters pretty well in terms of trying to get you to understand some of the sort of theoretical background for where some of this advocacy can come from. Often consequences are hard to determine beforehand. What that means here is when you're thinking of consequences of policies, sometimes, before you create the policy, some consideration is given to consequences, but often the only time that you can truly understand the consequences is after the policy has been implemented and it's being evaluated after a period of time. Has it worked? Has it not worked? Is it quote unquote good or bad? And again, how you judge good or bad can be from a neutral perspective or it could be from advocacy, a particular point of view. Only through evaluation after the fact can plausible correlations be made, pretty much what I just said, and then there can always be unintended consequences. That's an important point, is that often public policy, at least in terms of the analytical side, remember we're talking about consequences here, so we're talking about really policy evaluation analysis. You will take POL 530, those of you in the MPP program, which is policy analysis, and you'll get a good sense of what some of those unintended consequences, case examples might be. And in here, just to sort of whet your appetite as an example, I've put forward an example in terms of the U.S. government, something it does. The U.S. government has a history of publicly subsidized flood insurance. The what we're talking about here is public flood insurance at subsidized rates. So we're talking about the United States government actually providing flood insurance. It is the insurer, not a private entity, but the federal government. The National Flood Insurance Plan, NFIP is what it's called. It's severely underwater, pun intended, in terms financially. It owes, at this moment, in early 2015, it owes approximately about $25 billion to taxpayers in order to deal with all of its obligations. But this is something the U.S. government has done for decades. Since the late 1960s, it's had this program in place. So there is a public flood insurance program, subsidized rate. That's the what. The why is to provide affordable insurance for existing coastal living infrastructure while passing some of that risk onto coastal dwellers. So it exists because we have to get a little historical about this, but prior to the National Flood Insurance Program, there was no real flood insurance. There were no private carriers, at least any significant ones, in place to carry coastal flood insurance or any flood insurance, inland, coastal, etc. And the federal government often was responsible for disasters that happened to these areas through, again, a historical sort of happenstance of federal disaster relief, and that continues today. What I mean by that is that often areas that are devastated by floods, by hurricanes that accompany floods, the precursor events for floods, the federal government often comes in, declares the area a disaster, and then that opens the area up to federal disaster relief funds, which is extra money that's paid for. Some people at the federal government, when they were thinking about providing this and creating this insurance requirement decades ago, after World War II, the federal government thought about this and said, well, federal disaster relief is effectively a de facto zero premium insurance because those people choosing to live on the coast, there's increased rates in many areas of risk. So there's a higher risk in living along the coast for floods, for example. People are choosing to live there and they're passing that risk on to the government without having to internalize any of that risk. And the way that they're doing that is through federal disaster. They're relying on the government to come in should something happen and make everything better. And that's, taxpayer dollars at the end of the day, or borrowing. So the consequences, that's the why. There's a little bit of historical, so it makes sense that the federal government would want to put some of this risk. But it's highly subsidized. In other words, the federal government does not charge true market rates. And tried to do this very recently under the Biggert Waters Act in 2013, but it was a few months later, because of the sort of premium hikes it caused for many of these coastal dwellers and other people that lived in flood-prone zones, caused a lot of sticker shock and people were upset and there was a lot of public outrage. And so that statute, that change in Congress, passing more of the risk onto private citizens, was repealed. So we stand right now at still this significantly subsidized federal program. People pay very, very low insurance rates for high risk, basically. And the consequences is that there's a disconnect between actual and perceived risks with government carrying the costs. On the left, you see Boston. This is a little bit of the historical choices. So if we're thinking about policy, we're thinking about what government does, why it does it, what are the consequences. Well, think about it. You can see here in 1630, You can see what Boston was. It was about 783 acres, and in 1910 it was 1,904 acres. And you can see a lot of these additional parcels. There's a lot of filling that occurred. All of the areas you see, Back Bay, West Cove, Mill Pond, Great Cove, South Cove, all those areas are fill. That's where people, government mostly, government funded, privately funded some of it, especially way back when, but this is where there's been a historical sort of precedence for creating, these areas, reclamation projects where they would fill bays and land, wetland areas to create a larger landmass. What that does is that brings development right along the coastline. And on the right-hand side, I have an example here where I show you that if you can see the 1893 purple line, that's where the mean low tide mark, I believe, mean low tide mark was in this area back in 1893. So you can see that now there's a nice, there's a number of different pieces of, there's some beach there, but there's a road, there's a number of buildings, there's a large park, all right? There's a bunch of things that are there that used to be water over 100 years ago. That was water. So what we can see is that we're reclaiming land. There's a historical precedence for this, and it creates what I call a path dependence. So we ask ourselves, what does government do? Well, if government had a policy in place years ago, it doesn't really do so much of this anymore, but years and years ago had a policy in place of filling, you can see how that creates this sort of opportunity for people to live closer and closer to dangerous areas. What used to be wetlands is very low-lying land, right? It used to be submerged, it used to be underwater. And now we have habitation that's very close to those water lines. That's really, really at the lowest points, and we build up. You can see the buildup in the area. We build up all of this sort of infrastructure and all of these buildings and all of this capital expenditure, and that creates an expectation. So we can see a problem. Government has to deal with this problem. It's a difficult problem, especially now, today, if we add a new factor or a new variable, which is sea level rise. If the seas are rising, this just compounds this problem significantly. Here is Marshfield, Massachusetts. This is a different area, and it's just, again, to show you, if we look at approximately 1954, which is the sort of blue line that's out seaward, the farthest line that you can see. That was where the mean low water mark was in 1954, and you can see the approach of the sea significantly since then. You actually see what is obvious if you see the purple line, 1848, it was more landward. What happened is it's obvious that after 1945, if you see the landward side of this, it's obvious that this was a reclamation project, that this is salt marsh area, tidal flats, and what happened is that some policy was put in place after 1945 to fill a lot of this coastal region up and down along the coastline. So they created sort of this embankment, which then pushed that fill, that nourishment project, if you want to call it that. It pushed from the 1800s the mean low water mark, right, where the water hits the land. It pushed it further, the 1954 line, further seaward. But since that time, you can see what sea level rise has done. You can see that the sea is approaching back. It's making its way back, even though they created this. And of course, by creating this, if you look landward behind these rows of houses, you can see there's nowhere to go. They'd have to fill those salt marshes in order to create usable land. This is a policy that today, looking at this prior to doing a project like this, I think the answer would be no, let's not do this today. But again, this happened a long time ago, decades ago. We didn't have the information we had today. The reason I bring this up is because when you think about it, what is public policy, and we're thinking about what governments do, part of what governments do and what they choose to do is based in large part on what has already come before. A lot of times governments are dealing with the circumstances of the past, today's government anyway. So policy isn't as clean as we might think, because often it's about making compromises. And part of the reason we make those compromises is because of the conditions that we're given. Maybe today this is called a bad decision, but back in the 1940s, early 1950s, when it was very likely done, it wasn't such a bad decision. It was a good idea back then. It was taking something that was considered to be low value land. Now we know that these salt marshes are incredibly valuable in terms of the ecosystems services they provide, but looking at something that was relatively low in value and saying, no, we can make it high value by reclaiming that land and putting people there and providing all of this sort of these wonderful opportunities to see the shoreline. So those are just those lines. And then finally, this is Nantucket, Massachusetts, some of the highest value real estate in the country. And what this shows you is that there's a significant disconnect. And if you look at the 1846, look at all of the approach of the ocean in this area of Nantucket facing the Atlantic is significant. A lot of land has been lost between 1846, which is very far down toward the bottom of the picture, the purple line, to today, 2009. I think if I highlight those lines aren't going to match up. It didn't work out so well when I copied it over. But you can see the red line. It's right along the sand that's running in 2009. And you can see maybe in just above that red line on the right-hand side, the houses, to get a sense of scale, some of the houses along these areas. So we can see here that there's a lot of loss of land to the ocean, and there's erosion that occurs, but we know sea level rise is happening, and it's very likely that in the not too distant future, this is only going to exacerbate. And you have to think, what is government's role in terms of thinking about how to deal with this in the future? So sea level rise is occurring, actual risks are increasing, and the actions require matching perceived and actual risks. This is one way to interpret what government's role, what public policy is under these circumstances. In other words, government must require matching what the public perceives as risks to the actual risks that are posed. And this Nantucket is an example. This photo here is trying to provide to you an example of that the actual risks are getting pretty serious in many areas of the country. So how is this done? I have here a lot of information. You can see this in more detail because I don't want this video to go too long. You can see it on the slides. This video has the slides will be provided to you in PDF format. But you can see that in 2010, some of the things that we look at in trying to understand how do we fix this, how do we match the people's preferences for living along coastlines to the actual risks that exist in many of the coastlines in the United States. Well, this information tells you that, look, a lot of people prefer to live along the coast. The density is 319 people per square mile in 2010, whereas inland it's 61 people per square mile. So there's a significant preference for one reason or another. Some of it is just that some of our cities, our largest cities, are our coastal areas, and people are born in those areas disproportionately, or as opposed to the heartland or the middle of the country. But others are preference. People move to the coast significantly. For example, since 1970, the coast has added about 99 people per square mile, whereas inland areas have added about 22 people per square mile in terms of density. There's a significant preference in the public. So why is this important? Because if you're thinking about making a policy choice, if you're thinking about what government's role is, it needs to understand, well, what do people expect? What is their perception? What are their desires, their preferences? And here it's obvious that they have a significant preference for living along the coastline. The 2020 estimate is that coastal density will be about 343 persons, about 24 more persons per square mile than it was in 2010. That means there seems to be strong evidence that there's a continued preference for living along the coastline. This subsidized public insurance, this gives you a little bit of the historical context about, what I mentioned a few minutes ago, the idea that, there was no private insurance market, there was no public flood insurance, and that most of the insurance was happening, basically the federal government was covering the full risk of living along the coast and other flood-prone areas through federal disaster relief. And that's why the NFIP was created. But at the beginning it was entirely voluntary. When it initially became a policy, a legitimated policy through the passage of the statute in 1968, it was entirely voluntary. In 1972, Hurricane Agnes happened in New England. There were very few people that voluntarily chose to carry insurance when they knew that they would have federal disaster relief. In other words, how many of you would, this is maybe thinking about policy analysis and also program evaluation, other courses that you take in detail here in the MPP program, but you might just want to think about it. I mean, if you knew that your car was in essence insured by the state, let's say, that if you didn't carry car insurance and anything happened to your car and it was, declared a disaster, that the state would simply step in and buy you a new car. But you could voluntarily have car insurance and pay money out of your pocket every year to insure the car for essentially the same kind of loss. How many of you would actually pay the money, right? I mean, that's effectively, I think, what many people were saying when the NFIP was first created, and it was entirely voluntary. So the federal government, after 1972, after a huge loss, realizing few people had adopted the policy in 4 years, they decided to change some of it and implemented the Flood Disaster Protection Act in 1973, which created these special flood hazard areas and made, importantly, the insurance mandatory. So we think about what government does and what it does not do. A lot of the evaluation that goes on to help inform what they choose to do. So we often see changes made to policies, and in this case we're talking about a statute as a policy, a law, a federal law, and the amendments that were made to that law to refine the policy and make it more effective over time, making the insurance mandatory. And what we see here is that, if I can show you, if you look at the years 1978 through 2014, you can see the number of policies in effect. Significantly more people have adopted. You know, we went from 1.4 million people with flood insurance in 1978 to about 5.5 million policies in 2014, and covering about 1.3 trillion dollars worth of value. And so the premium that's charged, by the way, for that is 3.8 billion for 1.28 trillion of total value. That means that of those 5.5 million policies, they're paying a total of $3.8 billion. What that comes out to is about a 336 to 1 ratio. So every $1 that's paid to insure property, it's insuring $336 worth of property. It's not a great ratio. It shows a heavy subsidy by the federal government. So even now, that 3.8 billion is better than nothing. The federal government was getting zero in the past through federal disaster relief, which it still does, but at least now it has some mitigating money. But the losses, if you think about what it takes in, 3.8 billion at least in 2014, the losses, I mean, Sandy alone, Hurricane Sandy so far, and this is just for the insurance part, not for the federal disaster relief. Sandy is somewhere between 12 and 15 billion. Katrina was about 47.9 billion. Mind you, this 12 to 15 billion for Sandy does not include the over 50 billion that was passed by the federal government as federal disaster relief. This is just the insurance claims. So you can see that between 2000 and 2009, $670 billion of losses covered by the National Flood Insurance Program. It's not taking in nearly enough money. So what that tells you is that, well, the PCI is one entity that's done an analysis, that the premiums at best are a third of what is required to reflect the lowest assumptions of risk, not including sea level rise. The point is the federal government still significantly subsidizes this risk. Now the issue of this notion of subsidy, right, even though it does have federal flood insurance, the fact that the rates that are paid by the risk holders, right, the people that own the property, are so low, is that if you think about it from a policy or a sustainable planning as an aspect of policy standpoint, future harm and take steps to prevent that harm before it occurs. If you think that's the point of sort of like government sustainable planning, it imagines what a future harm is and it takes steps to prevent that harm. The major hurdle is the role of public risk perception about that future harm. How does the public perceive its risk? Risk perception is a function of both objective and subjective factors. Existing policy structures can influence risk perception, right? They can make you feel an area is more risky. What I mean by that is, say the federal government, you want to buy a house, it's on the water, and you find out that, oh, it's in a flood zone, but the insurance to cover that flood, the risk of flood, is $100 a year. That $100 a year really influences how you perceive that risk of flooding. You're saying, oh, if I'm insured for $100 a year, I don't see that as a very high risk, right? It's not a lot of money. So that means the risk must be low. I understand I'm in a flood zone, but I think it's low because the price that I'm paying for the insurance reflects in some way the risk. So the point is, when you subsidize that price that's paid, you create a miscue with the individual between their perception of risk and what the actual risks are. And that the changes in background conditions can influence risk perception. If sea level rise is happening and that water is approaching further, then the damage that's going to occur is going to be that much more. Coastal flood insurance, this is what I was just saying, as a proxy for risk. Flood insurance premiums provide what we call a price signal for risk. Subsidies and premiums create a bias in the price signal. So the more subsidy I give you, the less risk you perceive. The less subsidy I give you, the more risk you perceive. And that the bias can lead to an inaccurate signaling of risk. What does that look like? Government fully subsidizes insurance costs, no premium charge. That is a very low perception of risk, whereas the government provides insurance subsidy that creates a premium below market value. There's a low perception of risk. And what about federal disaster relief? That's a de facto total low perception of risk. What this is saying is that everything the government has been doing over the past 40 years, from a policy standpoint, has provided coastal dwellers and people that are in flood-prone areas a very low perception of risk in those areas. Here's a visualization of what that means. So essentially the policies in place very likely that have subsidized risk create this disconnect. If you see the red and black lines on the left-hand side, the actual risks are unclear and poorly communicated. Individuals don't understand what they are. They're using the price they pay for insurance as a proxy for risk. And so the perceived and actual risks are really far apart. But if you internalize the risk on the right-hand side of the hatched dotted line, you can see that the actual risk and the perceived risk can come closer together. You can get people to start perceiving risk in a way that kind of mirrors the actual risk. Now, Biggert-Waters did some of that. For example, there's anecdotal cases where individuals, were paying $500 a year, and that was going up to $20,000 a year for their flood insurance. Unfortunately, that's definitely sticker shock, and those are extreme examples. But using that as an example, if $20,000 actually reflected if that was an honest proxy for the actual risk of living in that area, a flood-prone area or disaster area, then that individual should internalize that cost because it helps to make them make a better decision about whether or not they should be living there, right? Or maybe some of the steps they should take to mitigate the risk, right? That's the kind of thing, because it may be spending $10,000 to mitigate that risk and lower that premium significantly or get rid of it. I don't know if you could ever get rid of it. It's definitely worth it when your insurance premiums are $20,000 a year. But spending $10,000, to retrofit your house, for example, when you're only paying $500 a year in insurance, doesn't really make economic sense to the individual. I hope some of this makes sense to you. So the effect there on the left is a disconnect between actual and perceived risk, where on the right there's a better connection between actual and perceived risks. So the behavior of price signaling, this is saying is that people, when you use prices as signals to understand policy responses, how individuals behave, preferences, that sort of thing. Prospect theory, something that you might or might not get into, it suggests that individuals generally overweight low probability risks while underweighting high probability risks. So all things being equal, people are really not good at understanding risk. That's what that says. So you definitely don't want to give them reason to even misstate risks further, right? You don't want to subsidize risk to give them even a further misperception of risk. And then people experiencing large losses from flooding tend to allow their insurance to lapse sooner than people experiencing smaller losses from flooding. Well, that definitely follows prospect theory. So some of the evidence in looking at flood insurance policies, people who have that have large losses, which is, by the way, proof positive that they live in significantly risky areas, they tend to let their flood insurance lapse. They say, okay, I don't need this anymore because I had a large loss. And that's because people misunderstand the probability of risk. They do. But when they have small losses, like a bit of flooding in their basement, for example, they tend to hold on to their policies. It creates this significant disconnect, this relationship, which you would say is this interesting relationship where as the intensity of loss increases, the flood insurance adoption, it decreases. The amount of adoption decreases. So when intensity of flood is high, loss is high, flood insurance adoption is low, and in the alternative, when intensity of loss is low, flood insurance adoption is high. That's counterintuitive, and that shows in many ways that people are misperceiving risks. And certainly, it's very likely that government's playing a role by charging below market rates for flood insurance. This is what we'd want to see. The goal is to reverse this relationship by forcing an internalization of risk. Well, that's all for now. What I wanted to show you in this presentation, go back here for a moment, is just that what is public policy? There's three big questions we ask. There's a number of pieces of material in the book to help you explain what public policy is, but it's essentially what government chooses to do and what it chooses not to do. Now, it's also what government does and does not do, but the choice starts getting us into the deeper questions, which is why. Why is government doing this? For example, in what I just showed you, government chooses to offer subsidized rates because it wants people, at least initially, to adopt those rates, to actually come in to flood insurance. So we can see that the subsidy at the beginning probably made some sense because you wanted to give people a reason, a carrot, to incentivize them to start carrying flood insurance. But that subsidy has continued through path dependence over time when the objective risks keep increasing to the point today where in conditions of sea level rise, it creates a real problem from a policy standpoint. So what I've tried to offer you in the example just provided is not only what government does, but also some explanation as to why government might be doing what it does, some of the path dependence that might be influencing the current policies we see today. We know government provides flood insurance. It's just like saying we know government spends money on Medicare. We know government spends 25% on Social Security of its federal budget in fiscal year 2013. So we know those things, very descriptive. The question is why? Why do they do it? And that's sort of the larger extension. So throughout this course, what you're going to be introduced to is not only some of the descriptive aspects of public policy, but some of the tools, some of the cognitive tools, some of the theories that are presented to help us understand why policy is what it is, why governments do what they do, and what are some of the sort of forces behind government action. I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to you interacting with the rest of the course. As one final note, you'll also, as I noted earlier, this video, there's the slides. The slides will be made available to you directly on the module site as a PDF document. Okay, thank you very much.